thanks to Okvi and Vezor, Atre Gupta, Ulrich, and the organizers for bringing us all together. So what I'll do is I'll focus on two artists. For this talk, because time is short, I'll focus on these two artists, Ibrahim Al Salahi, who is Sudanese and is now living in the UK, spent a lot of time in Qatar as well, and Anwar Jalal Shamsa, who was born in India, was lived in Pakistan and lived in the UK for much of his life. And what is important about them for the purposes of this comparison is that both of them attended the Slade, in the 50s, and had similar experiences, and in some ways their later work can also be thought about in a sort of a relation to each other, I'm going to spend less time on Ibrahim Al Salahi because I know that Chika Okeke's paper is also going to touch on Ibrahim Al Salahi's work. That's tomorrow, I think, right? Ibrahim Al Salahi's painting, The Last Sound, from 1964, executed on a square canvas with a carefully limited palette of grays and earth tones, is organized around a circular dynamic core. Radiant lines thrust outward from a barely perceptible African mask-like form. Celestial bodies, elements of calligraphic, geometric, and animate shapes, and actual palimpsest-like Arabic calligraphic prayers surround the central form, creating a universe in which the last sound is echoed. The title of the work refers to the Islamic practice of reciting prayers for the dead and the dying. In this work, Al Salahi renders the soul's passage from the corporeal to the celestial as it travels towards heavenly forms inhabiting the universe and beyond. The Last Sound, however, is not a narrative or realist work, but a manifestly modernist one, in which the terrifying event is metaphorized in a dynamic formal composition. Here, the abstraction of African sculptural forms and calligraphy serves to universalize the event. No realist or academic visual language could obviously be adequate to the scope of the subject. The relation Al Salahi creates between African abstract forms and Arabic calligraphy that itself refers to a larger Islamic discursive textuality invokes the gravitas of its theme. The assured handling of the visual language with which The Last Sound is painted might lead one to imagine that Al Salahi is working from an aesthetic grammar already in place, perhaps developed much earlier. But it was only very recently that Al Salahi himself had articulated the linkage between Arabic calligraphic and African sculptural forms. The Last Sound was painted during the middle of an intense period of modernist experimental effort carried out by the artist between 1958 and the late 60s. It is the working out of his concerns by praxis and by the overthrowing of his academic training at the Slade School of Fine Art in London, which he attended from 1954 to 1957. It's this overthrowing of that training that mark Al Salahi's intellectual concerns during this later era. While Al Salahi's contribution is distinctive in developing an aesthetic of decolonization for the Sudan and for much of Africa, situated among this kind of Islamicate textuality, African plastic forms, and transnational modernism, it can usefully be compared to other modernist artists from the quote-unquote Muslim world who were engaged with similar cultural problems in the wake of decolonization from the mid-20th century onward. Between the mid-50s and the 70s, artists from North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia reworked Arabic calligraphic motifs in entirely new ways. By Arabic calligraphy, I also refer to other languages written in that script, such as Persian and Urdu. Earlier attitudes towards classical Arabic calligraphy were not only decisively modified, but also modern Western genres, such as academic realism in portraiture, landscape, and still life, that were still in vogue in the 50s, were also reshaped by a renewed concern with the abstract and expressive possibilities of the script. The script was utilized not simply in a classical manner to render beautifully a religious or a wise saying or a line of poetry, nor to endow it with ornamental form. Rather, the script was often imbued with figuration and abstraction to a degree that resisted a straightforward, literal or narrative meaning. The implication of calligraphy, modernist calligraphy with post-cubist art represents a broad artistic movement, and this paper explores the reasons why these diverse artists were compelled to grapple with common aesthetic issues during the post-1945, the post-war period. Their groundbreaking artistic projects can be understood in a variety of ways, as individual and subjective expressions, as enacting a dialogue with nationalism, and as a critical engagement with metropolitan modernism and cosmopolitanism. Artists that I examined in the larger study include Saadetain, who was born in 1930 from Pakistan, Charles Hossein Zandaroudi, born in 1937 in Iran, Shakir Hassan Ali Said, born in 1925 in Iraq, and many, many others. The Western avant-garde and sort of the Western modernism was clearly significant for this revival of this modernist calligraphic abstraction. For the mid-20th century non-Western artists, the aftermath of Picasso's Cubism, Wilfredo Lam's surrealist synthesis of Cubism with Africana religions in Cuba during the 40s, and such mid-20th movements such as letterism, art brut, and art informal were far more compelling modalities than older perspectival and realist European academic styles. A genealogy of European inflected training was also a common factor for many of these artists. Al Salahi trained in London from 1954 to 1957, and then traveled extensively during the 60s in West Africa, in Europe, in Mexico, and including holding extended fellowship in the US. The significance of the work of these artists, however, is by no means reducible to European and academic and American prototypes. The challenges that decolonization posed for culture in Asian and African nations formerly under direct or indirect British rule was especially acute in the 2 decades after 1955. A profound and intensive search for new artistic languages began at that time, which would seek to recover expressivity that had been repressed under colonialism, but would also produce a new modern culture. This growing awareness of national independence and sovereignty created a demand for a new aesthetic of decolonization, one that would remain in dialogue with metropolitan developments, but would also account for regional and nationalist specificities. Artists attempted to find visual languages adequate to the aspirations of decolonization by creating work that appeared to fulfill the expectation of a national art. Hence, it's no surprise that this intensive and fertile period of artistic creativity has been primarily understood as a nationalist undertaking. Indeed, one can find numerous studies in which artistic and aesthetic developments during this period are understood as basically as national histories, right? So one of the things I'm trying to argue is that many of these artists, you can script them as part of national histories, okay? But I think the project that I'm trying to undertake, and some of us are trying to undertake, is also to see them as not just simply as national artists, but also artists working out the larger problems of decolonization, which are not simply limited to, in a sense, a kind of a national history. So in some ways, this paper is arguing against the scripting of these figures solely as national figures, okay? One can find numerous studies in which artistic and aesthetic developments during this period are understood as national ventures. However, the demands put on cultural production in the mid-60s were highly overdetermined. The new culture was to be individuated, yet collective. It was to be modern in the sense of being in dialogue with artistic production in the industrialized world, yet it was also mandated to represent local histories and lived practices that were suppressed. And above all, the new culture was to be emblematic of a sort of a regional or national or a specificity. The gap between academic art and post-colonial realities was vast. Clearly, the stakes were very high, as artists were expected to produce nothing less than the development of a new cultural language that would exploit the opening provided by decolonization, understood at this time as an opportunity to enact a truly world historical shift in politics and culture, but these demands could not be reconciled easily. Artists who grappled with these challenges in their sweeping, highly charged careers became sort of legends, and basically this whole generation is a kind of a legendary, heroic sort of a generation, right? In Sudan, Al Salahi is regarded as one of the founders of the Khartoum School of Art, and through his teaching and artwork became a highly influential and dynamic exemplar for successive generations of Sudanese and African artists. The national framework is thus fundamental in situating these artists as eminent cultural figures who each developed schools of national artistic practice. However, the link between national art and the diaspora also needs to be taken into account. It is in the diaspora that many of these artists encountered the range and strength of Western artistic practices firsthand. They were able to visit the great Western museums filled with canonical works, which they had previously seen only in magazine reproductions. It is in the diaspora that many of these artists met with other Western and non-Western artists, learning about one another's methods and concerns. However, artists frequently sought institutional support to develop their careers in the diaspora as well, as such support was not as well established in their own countries. Al Salahi's intellectual formation was forged during his study in London and became even broader during his travels in the US during the early and mid-60s, when he had a chance to meet with artists, jazz musicians, black political activists, and black intellectuals. He also traveled to Mexico to meet artists there and to China to study its artistic pedagogy. As the example of negritude shows, in an important sense, the experience of diaspora engendered transnational aesthetic movements as well as new affiliations of identity and community. Al Salahi also facilitated the imaginings of a broader Africanist aesthetic, not least by his participation in exhibitions in Nigeria and Senegal during the 60s. His rejection of academic training he had received in England was prompted by his awareness when he returned to the Sudan of his training's inadequacy and irrelevancy to the role that art ought to play in post-colonial Sudan. Earlier, Al Salahi and Shamsa were at the Slade School of Art during the 50s, and both had become painfully aware of the marginal status accorded to Islamic art in the public lectures delivered by the celebrated art historian Ernst Gombrich. And by the late 50s and early 60s, the failure of academic painting to break out of the tiny, narrow, elite salon and gallery exhibition circuit of Khartoum and to engage with a more democratic and vernacular visual culture impelled Salahi towards a radical aesthetic shift. So this is from his memoirs that he has recently written. And Salahi notes that the problem of finding an adequate audience for his work, that when he first arrived back to Khartoum, was making work still based upon the training he had received at the Slade, right? And he says, we had a problem that separated the contemporary artists from the local public. A bridge had to be built to close that gap. Something work-wise had to be done. In other words, it's through practice. There is no a priori formula for finding this. It is only through practice that one can engage, okay, in this project. I said to myself, man, let's us for some time forget about those archaic conceptions for art and art's sake, and all that unreal nonsense of the muse and ivory tower that we read about and get down to work, right? Okay, I worked like mad, introduced Arabic writing and decorative patterns in a corner of my works like a stamp on an envelope. And then he sees, he sees a favorable response, right? Finally, I limited my, there's formal sort of changes taking place in his work in terms of, color schemes as well as compositions, right? And then he says, I had to break down the bone of the letter. These are his words, right? I had to break down the bone of the letter, observing the space within a letter and between the letters. The Pandora's box opened up wide before my eyes. I discovered animal and plant forms, sounds, human images, and what looked like skeletons with masked faces. In other words, Africanist kind of forms emerging from this kind of fracture of the Arabic calligraphic form, okay? Okay. And just a few works from sort of the mid-60s. This is an etching, the River Nile. And let's look at this work. So the concerns that Salahi articulates in his statements are evident in a series of paintings whose very title, "They Always Appear," signifies the emergence of figural forms among the spaces defined by the figure-ground relationship of abstracted calligraphic shapes. Al Salahi's experiments thus resulted in an abstraction that was regional yet modernist, and that referred to the vast ensemble of iconic and textual material traversing the Arabic Islamic discursive tradition as well as West African iconography. Okay, now I'm going to turn to Shamsa. I'm giving you a presentation based on a study of his writings and a significant part of his artistic production. Born in Shimla in India in 1928 to a Kashmiri and Punjabi family who at that time had owned a carpet and military embroidery business, Shamsa studied in high school in Lahore. After a year in university reading philosophy, Persian, and Arabic, he convinced his father of the seriousness of his artistic vocation and joined the Mayo School of Art in 1944. Upon graduation, in 1947, he set up a commercial design studio in Shimla. The bloody trauma of the partition of India into post-colonial India and Pakistan in 1947, in the same year of his graduation, saw the killing of many of Shamsa's family members, a memory that continued to haunt him throughout his life. Shamsa taught at various schools and colleges in Lahore until 1956, where he left to study at the Slade School of Fine Art in London. During the late 40s and the mid-50s, Shamsa had become associated with the circles of the Urdu literary intelligentsia and contributed to the sphere by his writings and by his organizational works. During this period, literature, poetry, and especially fictional writing dominated Lahore's intellectual environment. Even while working on his paintings, Shamsa actively participated in this literary sphere. He published several novels in Urdu. These are 3 of the novels by him, and with the covers also designed by him. Okay. Edited a journal, wrote and performed a number of radio plays, and contributed poetry to various publications under pseudonyms. At that time, the competing stylistic and ideological groups included the secularist and non-nationalist progressive writers, who were basically leftist writers, and they were in a sense considered to be not necessarily nationalist, Pakistani in a simple way, right? In fact, they were seen to be kind of opposed to another group which was kind of a right-wing Pakistani nationalist, right? And there was a third group which was the arts for art's sake kind of group, okay? Much of this debate continued shifting the contours of the ongoing battle between progressivism, which was equated with art for life, and literary modernism, which was termed as art for art, right? The move towards painterly modernism needs to be situated accordingly as an affirmation of its metaphoric and allegorical potentialities in offering a deeper insights into the self and society than the kind of reductive realism that the progressives had increasingly embraced from the late 30s. So in other words, one way to understand Shamsa is to situate him within the literary environment and to see why he moves towards a kind of a non-figural and, in a sense, art for art's sake kind of modernism. And one of the ways you can map this out based on the literary sort of map is that the progressives had increasingly become a sort of Stalinist, right, in the sense that you could only write socially realist kind of fiction and so on, okay? And you couldn't really use metaphor, or you couldn't really use any other kinds of rhetorical forms that were not directly realist, okay, in that way, okay? Shamsa was founder of the Lahore Art Circle, a group of young artists who aspired towards modernism and abstraction during the early and mid-50s. And just giving you a sense of the sort of, images from that period, okay? In 1953, a group of young writers and modern artists began issuing a short-lived journal, which was intended to address issues faced by modernist thinkers. These discussions included the relevance for contemporary culture of the modernism of Eliot, Pound, and Baudelaire, painterly modernisms of Cezanne, Matisse, Klee, and Kandinsky, along with the significance of Indian, cultural thinkers like Kabir and Mirabai, as well as numerous Muslim thinkers across the ages. Shamsa's exposure to these debates in his later career may be seen in his response to the writings of Rilke and The Art of Clay, his embrace of modernism as a praxis in a highly disciplined and rigorous fashion, and most significantly in the role that textuality and letterism play in the construction of history and memory in his works. Shamsa studied at the Slade from 1956 through 1960. Stuart Hall has identified post-war Black British diaspora artists as arriving in 3 distinct waves, okay? And I'm quoting from Stuart Hall now. The artists of the first wave came to London in a spirit not altogether different from that in which Picasso and others went to Paris, to fulfill their artistic ambitions and to participate in the heady atmosphere of the most advanced artistic centers of artistic innovation at the time. As colonials, they had been and are still thought of as marginalized from such developments. In fact, they came to Britain feeling that they naturally belonged to the modern movement, and in a way, it belonged to them. The promise of decolonization fired their ambition, their sense of themselves as already modern persons. It liberated them from any lingering sense of inferiority, end quote. Okay, so this is the quote from Stuart Hall. However, far from being accepted as an equal as a modern artist, the Slade years marked an existential crisis for the artist, which he lucidly summarized in a statement written in 1963. And I'm just giving you a few excerpts from that statement in the next 3 slides. So this is a statement he wrote in 1963 reflecting on his experiences at the Slade, okay? Now, it may be noted that Al Salahi, when I talked to Al Salahi about this, he said, I attended the same Gombrich lectures and it produced more or less the same effect on me, okay? So Professor Gombrich is responsible, I think, for the careers of at least 2 artists, okay? Okay, and just to remind you of Salahi's work. Okay. Shamsa's existential crisis was artistic as well as personal. As accelerating a city that London was, it was also profoundly alienating. In a letter from 1957, he notes, London, the world's biggest city, but if one is alone, it instantly becomes a forlorn and frightening jungle, end quote. Precisely due to his sense of dislocation, and even because his previous artistic achievements offered him no solace, the Slade years were highly productive for him. Not only did he work intensively on his own paintings, but he was also exposed to the range of global art housed in British museum collections. And he engaged in a study of Islamic art forms from various periods and regions, an opportunity that was simply unavailable in Pakistan, where even Mughal paintings produced in Lahore were not well represented in the city's museum. During these years, the mediation of Paul Klee's work also proved important for him and was fully acknowledged by Shamsa. He now began developing his own work based on his lived and studied knowledge and experience of carpet patterns, Mughal architecture from Lahore, and calligraphic forms. It was during the Slade period that Shamsa abandoned his earlier, what I would call, illustrative approach to modern art and began his search for a deeper compositional schema for a calligraphic abstraction. This quest occupied him intensively for the remainder of his career. The artist considered still life from 1958 to be a breakthrough into his mature phase. It moves from a volumetric depiction of spaces and objects in the lower part of the painting to an abstract, flattened, and calligraphic rendering at the upper middle part of the canvas, prefiguring his later work. So in other words, if you see this canvas, it's kind of schizophrenic, okay? At the lower part, you see volume, and the upper part, you see flatness, okay? And he's basically moving towards kind of flatness, okay? Shamsa had met Mary Taylor in 1957, and they were married soon after. Deeply interested in art education, Shamsa's wish was to return to Lahore to join the National College of Art, previously the Mayo School of Art, where he had studied. The artist was aware of his responsibility as a post-colonial intellectual and responsibilities towards his quote-unquote home. But he wasn't able to find a suitable position at the Mayo School or at the National College. Deeply unhappy with the poor career choices available to him in Pakistan, he decided to move permanently to England in 1961, choosing to live in the Midlands, where the family would be close to Mary's parents. Thereafter, Shamsa taught art education in schools. Yeah, that's fine, okay. And the relative isolation of the Midlands meant that he could devote himself to an intense exploration of his mature artistic project. Nevertheless, he continued to show in the UK as well as in Pakistan and in other places. Okay, and let me just give you a few sense of the shows he participated in. So, one of the ways that he could participate in shows in England itself was under the Commonwealth rubric, right? And this is an invitation card from Gallery 1, and I think many of you would recognize many of the names on this list, right? And so the question is that here you have artists from the former colonies, okay, coming and studying in England and trying to exhibit their works, and they end up showing together in these kind of Commonwealth, platforms. Okay, now is this a ghetto or is this an enabling, right? Or is it both at the same time, right? Would be the kind of question, right? Okay. He investigated, let me just show you, continuing to show his work in Karachi, and you can see the, that breakthrough painting on the right side. Okay, he investigated a small number of themes: city walls, architecture, electronic circuit boards, the letter meme, okay, and a few others. He experimented with innovative technical procedures and worked to introduce references to fabrics, textiles, and textures in numerous works. The artist's sketchbooks formed the basis for his experimentation. And the numerous compositions he developed there are marked with notations in English and Urdu. The sketchbook merited detailed study, obviously, for this reason. Now, Shamsa distilled his experiences into a disciplined formalist practice, much of it based on geometry, right? And for example, in this work, he notes in Urdu, a circle, a square, a puzzle, for which a lifetime is not enough to unravel. These geometric forms would provide him with a set of finite yet flexible building blocks. Much of his work is seen to reference the shape of the letters B and D in English, right? And you can see that basically in his later work. This is the cover of The Other Story, which was the important 1989 Hayward exhibition, curated by Rashid Arain, in which his work appears on the cover, right? And let me see. However, the calligraphic dimensions of many of his works, especially the Roots series, which I'll discuss very shortly, draw upon the sinuous lines of the Arabic alphabet, as well as venture far beyond rigid geometric abstraction. Much of Shamsa's work draws on a creative tension between geometric abstraction derived from Roman alphabet and the sinuous character of the Arabic alphabet. In works such as Love Letter 1, one sees the composition bound by a geometric reticulation in passages of varying modulation and frequency. Yet here, using the Roman alphabet, the work strains against its strict geometric form. Shamsa's career culminated in his Roots series, which he executed from 1977 until his untimely death in 1985. So in some ways, it's unfair to see this as a kind of a culmination of his career, because when I spoke with Mary Shamsa, she said he wasn't planning to die, so it's not like, we can see that as a kind of, but nevertheless, okay. Structurally, these works often delineate an imagined plant form in the upper half of the picture. while the lower half depicts root forms developed in 1970, in 1977, both upper and lower forms are rendered in flat optical shapes of a richly textured hand-dyed cloth, while works developed from 1983 are more frequently based on abstracted Arabic cursive scripts that are, however, not legible. So this is a sketchbook of the Root series, and let me just show you two works from the Root series. Okay, so this is a work which is ink on paper. So basically, the grammar of these works is you have this imagined and fantastic foliate form on the top, and then you have this root-like calligraphic work at the bottom, right? And also this one, okay? I don't know why it keeps jumping around, although I don't have it on timer, but let me keep it on this one. Okay. These works relay the question of diaspora in a formally restrained language based on calligraphy and ornamental design inspired by, I would say, oriental carpets and textiles. Made on a small format, they're very tiny. Their movable character recalls works by other artists who also grappled with the issues of portability and movability of the artistic form as an experience of exile and diaspora. Moreover, Roots, while retaining a strong sense of formal discipline in serial execution, is unabashedly more decorative than much of Shamsa's earlier work. So one of the things that one can trace in his career is also he's moving more and more and veering dangerously close to decoration, okay, and to pattern and to ornament, right? Okay. And now, of course, Adolf Loos had declared that modern man's love of ornament was a sign of his criminality and degeneracy, right? And there's any number of thematic and formal ways by which modernism strove very hard to distinguish itself from being simply equated with ornament and decoration. It may be noted that Islamic art has been characterized in art historical scholarship precisely as ornamental, decorative, or applied, or functional in the way Gombrich had described it in his lecture. That proved to be so shattering to Shamsa earlier. In the lecture, for modern artists drawing inspiration from Islamic art, however, the relation between modernism and decoration cannot be so easily disavowed. In one sense, Roots series brings to the dangerous question of ornament and its relation to modernism to a point of crisis, especially with reference to modernism's intimate yet unacknowledged reference to the arts of the non-Western world. Moreover, the roots of the plant forms in the later works are textual and letterist, right? So suggesting that a return to one's root can no longer be based on a kind of a blood and soil or a national affiliation, but the roots themselves have now become transnational in their historic and contemporary valences, because texts don't belong to any place, right? Because once you write something and it becomes textual, it is transnational already, right? So for many artists from North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, there were two main ways in which experiments with modern art were broadly undertaken. Folkloric, figurative, and representational styles can be contrasted with the practices that emphasize the textual and calligraphic and abstract works, and really, works marked by figural absence. The folkloric and figurative mode consists of motifs that devote presence, village scenes and symbols from ancient civilizations, etc., cityscapes, and so on, portraiture. But in the textual, abstract, and calligraphic modes, there is an absence and an evacuation of iconic signifiers. And even calligraphy itself is often deployed in highly abstract and largely illegible fashion. So none of these are readable, right? And the point is that this whole period in which calligraphy is used is not, you can't really read the, it's used as a, it's used in paradoxical ways, right? Rather than indexing specific meanings from a textual source, mutilated calligraphy indexes textuality itself. The deferral of meaning that textuality enacts as a general phenomena is further doubled by the difficulty in deciphering such calligraphic forms that lean heavily towards abstraction. Unlike pre-modern calligraphy, the modernist experiments are no longer render something in a beautiful or ornamental form, in a legible form, but rather raise questions of legibility itself, right? So in the hands of these artists, the very illegibility of calligraphy, in its dialogue with this what I would call post-cubist figuration and its non-ornamental renderings, opens up the phenomena of textuality to refer to a constellation of affiliation in which elements from Africa, from Shiite vernacular culture in Iran, or from Indo-Persian poetry in South Asia all exceed the boundaries of nationality. Such artists re-territorialize the Arabic script, foreground its discursivity, while also making its aesthetic permeable to the outside, thus problematizing a simple binary homology between art and national identity. Okay. So the question is, what does textuality do, right? The textuality here is, the paradox of using this work is, and its illegibility, I think, orients itself towards modernism, but also marks the necessary demand for genealogical legibility in terms of tradition, okay? So in the sense that if you think of the colonial project as also premised upon the textual fixing, okay, of peoples, okay? Here you have a kind of an artistic form that seemingly draws upon a kind of gesturing towards the text, okay, which is of course illegible and abstracted and so on, okay? So it points to the necessary demand for this legibility in terms of a genealogical tradition, but also its impossibility in a sense at the same time, right? Because it's not really present, for the work of these artists in any way that is continuous from the pre-modern, okay? All right, and let me just show you a few more works by other artists. So, the other artists you can think about in comparison would be some of these, Saadat from Pakistan. So this is Saadat in 1966, working in France at that time in Paris, where it's a self-portrait of him, and his fingers spell the word Allah, okay? Okay. And another work by Saadat from an earlier work by 1960. Madiha Umar is actually maybe the first artist who begins this, right? And she is an Iraqi artist, and these are really early works, right, from the 40s, okay? Some of these works she developed while in the US and while working with and in collaboration with scholars of Islamic art, okay? And Shakir Hassan Ali Saeed from Iraq, a couple of his works, and he's also a very important and noted thinker, and he's a very, so he has a number of texts that reflect upon, the question of the predicament of the modern artist in Iraq, but beyond, and Iraq, the Arab world, and beyond, basically, right? And Zandaroudi, who now lives in Paris, okay, did this work in Tehran. And these works are seen to be part of what is called the Sakka Khane school, which draws upon Shiite kind of popular Shiite vocabulary, right? So work from 1959 and another work from 1971. Okay, so let me end here, okay? And I'll be very happy to, if there's time, to take questions. Thank you.
Questions. Your last work, of course, looks very much like when André Masson was being inspired by Chinese work in Boston and went into calligraphy as a Western painter, which already disturbs the waters. But I would like to go back to this Slade period, because I think it's not very fair to set up an antithesis between what you said metropolitan something or other and the aesthetic of a new colonialism. First of all, it seems to me that obviously Gombrich's very bad lecture when it came to the Islamic, bearing in mind the story of art was so recent, obviously he wasn't an Islamic scholar, had an entirely positive effect, because the work you showed later showed him espousing the modernism of people like Terry Frost, who were exhibiting at the Redfern Gallery at the time. London at the time, at that particular moment, was not only full of extraordinarily positive, well-connected, internationally collected modernist galleries like the Redfern, like the Hanover Gallery, like Brian Robertson at the Whitechapel, putting on major retrospectives like Nicholas de Stijl, who was shown at Tooth, all the way through, perfectly modernist in his actual intellectual environment. But the thing that's so important is that people like Peter de Francia, who was a painter on John Berger, were communist intellectuals deeply involved with anti-colonialist positions, and there were figures like V.S. Nepal. There were a whole charismatic crowd of anti-colonialist intellectuals. There was not a sense of oppression, but a brotherhood of cosmopolitan struggle in the context of the Algerian War. So I just think that to say bad Slade, and the Slade at this time is precisely where Victor Passmore had evolved from doing kind of Slade 30s figuration to the abstraction he was doing in the 50s. So I think the antithesis is rather misleading, and especially if your second guy goes and marries an Englishwoman and lives in the Midlands, I don't see this as kind of exile. And I also think that by the time we get to the late 80s, you're showing work which is profiting from the activism of Rashid Areen and the intellectuals around him for 10 years through the very militant period of the 70s, when Rashid Areen himself is using a lot of very calligraphic stuff. So the return, kind of late career return to using calligraphy with a sense of identification and brotherhood with other artists such as Rashid, I find entirely understandable. I just think things need to be a little bit more modulated and generous in terms of context. In particular, people like Peter de Francia, who was a friend of mine, and whose militancy I really appreciate, and Berger and things. That's what I'd just like to add, because your images were extremely beautiful and powerful.
No, thank you for that comment. So let me just say that regarding Masson, I think surrealism is important for, as one genealogy in these artists, because I think surrealism also with automatic writing and with other sort of developments, is, I think, something to think about in relation to this. Now, regarding the Slade, what I've shown here is, and what I've discussed is actually the self-reflection by the artists themselves, right? So this is the self-reflection by, the statement I showed is by Shamsa, right? And also, I interviewed Ibrahim Al Salahi, and he says, I trained at the Slade, I go back to Khartoum, I show my work and nobody responds to it, okay? So, having said that, I completely take your point that, and also in the sense that they may, of course, London is an international city at that time, and so is Paris. And I think we need post-colonial histories of both cities. We don't have them. Okay, we have more for London, huh? Yeah, maybe we need to be more aware of them perhaps, okay? And they need to be more widely circulated, right? Because you have artists from Africa, you have artists from the Caribbean, you have artists from the Middle East, you have artists from East Asia who are converging there, and they are many times showing the same galleries or hanging out. We just don't know, or at least I don't know enough about that, right? I'd like to know more. And in terms of solidarities, of course, there are individual solidarities, but we are also talking about institutions. In other words, that while there may be plenty of individual solidarity, especially among people who are inclined towards leftist kind of, who have a leftist orientation, okay, whether that translates into possibilities for institutional exhibitions is something that I think is not clear to me, okay. That's why, otherwise you wouldn't have, I mean, how do you explain something like this card, okay. Yeah, let me just say, international brotherhood, I agree, but, in restricted spaces, okay? Yeah.
Please, the lady.
Just to change the thrust of our discussion a little bit, I think I'd like to get you to think a little bit about what I thought was one of the most interesting theoretical interventions that you were making in this talk, which is the question of legibility versus illegibility in calligraphy. And in a sense, this is a question that, it's a question that's about your title, whether or not we want to talk about calligraphic abstraction per se.
Yeah.
And it's also a question about, imperative question. Reiko and I were sitting here talking about calligraphy in Japan.
Yeah.
As you were speaking. We were talking about Morita Shiryu and Bokubi, and the ways in which Japanese artists in the post-war period were also rethinking questions of calligraphy. But they were not thinking in the same ways that you were characterizing Shamsa and Al Salahi, in the sense that they were not thinking about abstraction. They knew that they obviously were translating their work for an audience that was thinking about abstraction. They were translating their works for abstract expressionists. So Morita Shiryu talked about, for example, creating work for non-character reading peoples. But he himself did not believe that his work should be divorced from the character, and that for him, the character was the essence of what he was doing. And that this question of abstraction is really about a kind of misunderstanding, a mistranslation, an inability to overcome these differences, rather than finding ways of translating. And I'm wondering if this question, this title that you're using, Calligraphic Abstraction, if that's something that Al Salahi and Shamsa are using themselves, or is this a kind of projection from the West, from artists, Masson, who look at Chinese calligraphy and say, well, I can't read it, so it must be abstract?
So it's probably a projection from me rather than from Masson, okay? I mean, you see, the thing is that, this is, one of the things that, I take seriously from, let's say, post-colonial pedagogy is the question of catachresis, that, you have categories that don't quite address the situation at hand, and that's the condition that we inhabit, I think. So the terminology so in a sense that Salahi and Shamsa are not thinking of themselves as part of this larger movement. I'm the one grouping them together, okay? So in that sense, it is not a consciously, manifesto-based kind of movement. Some of these people didn't even know each other. I mean, Salahi and Shamsa knew each other because they were together at the Slade. But in many of the other artists, they move in circuits that are similar. For example, in Paris, many of them show at the same gallery, right? Whether they were friends, whether they used to hang out, it's not clear to me. That's why I think we don't have a good sense of the texture of what happened in Paris in the 50s and 60s. We don't even have a good sense of the texture of what happened in London, I think. Okay? And so the question is, as an art historian, you come and look at certain phenomena and you want to make certain, you want to think about them, right? And that's what I'm trying to do. In a sense, calligraphic abstraction is my invention, right? To characterize the work of this diverse group of artists, okay? Will the term have problems? Probably it will have problems, but will it also enable certain things to become visible? That's what I'm hoping for, all right?
Yes, I don't have so much of a question, but it's the issue that was raised earlier about the Slade, because it figures largely in my own work, given the status of the Slade as the elite colonial art, college at the time. So artists were going from most of the British colonial world to the Slade to study. And it's important to emphasize that it wasn't just that these artists were going to the Slade, but the Slade was moderating artistic programs in Nigeria, in the Sudan, in other places. And if you look at the curriculum, it was so conservative. And that's probably because William Coldstream was in the 50s the head of the school. Yes. And William Coldstream, was very anti-Parisian modernism, throughout his career. So what these artists were responding to was the institutional framework under which their pedagogy was playing out. But you had individual networks. John Berger was writing about Sousa and was one of the important voices that supported his work. So yes, there were these important individual networks that were mostly anti-colonial, communist, socialist, and so forth. But in terms of the institutions themselves, they were embedded in the colonial hegemonic system. And that's what most of these artists were responding to in terms of their relationship between the self and what they imagined as a colonial institution.
Yeah, we actually have, Ibrahim Al Salahi has much of his work from the Slade period, and I've looked at that, and I completely agree with you. And that's, if you look at that, it's evident it's basically academic, training, and even Impressionism is not, they haven't even gone to Impressionism at this point in the Slade.
Thank you very much. Okwi, you have the final question, please.
Well, I don't so much have a question, but maybe partly a response to the first comment, which I also think really overstates the case for the Slade. And I think is symptomatic of the kind of defenses that could be put around modernism, that the question of the Slade and the artists from the colonies in London could not, extend beyond London and back to the places where those artists came from. And if we take Paris, for example, 1956, the first Congress of Negro writers and artists organized by President African, it was precisely this very question that was being adumbrated in the conference, and that the artists and writers were already challenging the given tropes of modernism that they were receiving right there in the capitals of the colony, if you will. But when Salahi goes back to Sudan to become a founder of the Khartoum School, he says in his use of calligraphy, he wanted to break the letter. The idea was to break the letter to the point of illegibility, so that it becomes a form and not a script, and therefore to transcend the form of decoration that is often attributed to calligraphy. So I think it's important that if we're going to do justice to the complexity of the negotiations that the artists in the metropolis were encountering, we also have to look beyond the metropolis itself and to look at the kind of work undertaken by those artists when they, say, showed in Nigeria. As Salahi's first major exhibition, in fact, was not in London. It was in Ibadan, in Bari. His very first catalog was not in London. It was in Nigeria in 1960. So I think it's important to sort of to broaden, the terrain, the discursive terrain in which the artists, operated in and what they produced in response to their very specific experiences in different academic contexts in the West.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Dadi. Thank you very much.